Our next speaker, as we proceed on our crisp schedule of the conference, is Joe Hartman, who teaches constitutional law here at Georgetown University, and also is a scholar of Reinhold Niebuhr, about whom he'll be speaking to us today, and who is a definitive figure in terms of how Christians in America have understood power and authority, and especially issues of war and peace. Joe is also an attorney and very active in an Anglican church in Northern Virginia. So Joe, if you would come forward, we appreciate your being here.
So what was that line? The dogma lives loudly with. Is that right? Is that it? Every time I hear that, I think it's something Yoda would say to Luke Skywalker. It's just a weird phrasing. Well, as Mark said, I'm going to talk today about Reinhold Niebuhr. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, he was the subject of my dissertation, and I almost feel like when I do these talks, there's pre-Trump and post-Trump. So this is sort of pre-Trump, but maybe not. We'll see. Niebuhr became really influential, I would say, about middle of the last decade through the end of the Obama years. I'll make a case that he's still very important, but we'll see how this goes. So Reinhold Niebuhr, if you don't know, or if you just kind of hear the name, probably one of the more influential public intellectuals of the last century. And his career stretched really from World War I all the way through to Vietnam. And it's hard to kind of pin him down. He preached sermons, he wrote newspaper articles, he wrote long, sort of more scholarly treatises, most famous of which is the Nature and Destiny of Man, which were his Gifford lectures delivered in Scotland in 1939, really right as World War II is starting. Perhaps most famously, he's credited with writing the Serenity Prayer, if you know that, which gained national fame when it was selected for inclusion in a prayer book given to the service members in World War II. Probably became more famous because of Alcoholics Anonymous, who used it. I'll give you just a quick kind of biographical sketch, and then I want to get to more substantive issues. So he was born in late 19th century. His parents were German immigrants. His father was a German pastor. German was his first language. After studying at Eton Theological Seminary, he went to Yale Divinity School, where he earned his master's. Spent about 10 years at a church in Detroit between 1915 and about 1928. That church grew from about 60 to 700. So, even early on as a pastor, he was gaining notice. But really, the meat of his career was spent from 1928 to 1960 at Union Theological Seminary, where he taught philosophy of religion and applied Christianity. Really, by the mid-40s, it's sort of astonishing. I don't have a graphic, but he was on the cover of Time Magazine's 25th anniversary edition. So imagine a theologian, not a pastor or pop, but a theologian on the cover of Time Magazine. Hans Morgenthau, sort of a political realist, 20th century political realist, called him the greatest living political philosopher in America in 1962. And when he died in 71, Time eulogized him as the greatest Protestant theologian in America since Jonathan Edwards. And then more recently, about 2000, Modern Library ranked The Nature and Destiny of Man as the 18th most important nonfiction work of the 20th century, which is quite surprising when you think that's ahead of A Theory of Justice, Rawls's book, Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, all given kind of a backseat to this book. So quite significant perception there. Now, a little bit about how this kind of renaissance, so he died in 1971 and sort of disappeared for a while, really reemerged at the beginning of the last millennium. Several of his books were reissued, articles are written. Probably the most famous example of this is an interview Barack Obama gave in 2007 to David Brooks. Now, query whether he was just trying to get David Brooks to write nice things about him. But he said Niebuhr was one of his favorite philosophers, and if you know anything about Brooks, you'll from time to time see Brooks mention Niebuhr. And just one more Within the last, I think, 3 or 4 months, PBS premiered an hour-long documentary on Niebuhr, so if you have a chance, it's worth looking at. It's called An American Conscience, the Reinhold Niebuhr story. So that's kind of the background. What I want to do with the rest of the time is kind of talk a little bit about why I think he's significant now, and I'm going to work outward. So I'm going to start with his account of what he called human nature. I realize that term itself, at least in the academic world, is fraught at this point, but we're going to use it. So start with kind of anthropology, human beings, and then work out to his political theory, and then work out to his assessment of politics, of sort of the practicalities of politics. So it's kind of starting individual, working out to a philosophy, and then working out to more practical concerns. Now, another thing you should know about Niebuhr is he tends to be claimed by both sides, which can be a good or bad thing. So you get people as disparate as Michael Novak and Cornel West calling themselves Niebuhrians, put those two together. He gets claimed, particularly during the Iraq War, he was claimed for both sides. So people who thought we should be involved in Iraq and involved in all that was going on there said, well, this is something Niebuhr would do. And there were people arguing that, no, this is completely against. Niebuhr would be very critical of this. He would be non-interventionist. I think part of that has to do with the fact that he did have a long career. He did move. Early in his career, he actually ran for mayor of New York as a socialist. By the 40s, he was a very dogged anti-communist Cold War liberal. So there was some movement there. I think also you have, because he wrote so much on current issues, sometimes people are trying to extrapolate things from a kind of issue position rather than a more substantive understanding of what his project actually was. And then just to throw one more sort of complication, Niebuhr himself once commented, quote, "Our problem, both in foreign policy and in other affairs, is how to generate the wisdom of true conservatism without losing the humane virtues which the liberal movement developed." So even he himself kind of throws some ambiguity into that. But all of that said, in all the ways people sort of try to use Niebuhr, I think Paul Elie had an essay called "A Man for All Reasons." Sort of anybody can claim him. But my argument, and what drew me, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. What drew me to Niebuhr is that you got to look a little deeper. If you're looking for a kind of political conservative or a political liberal, if you're kind of looking for that, you're really not looking where you should be. Because Niebuhr's real significance is that he's someone who's really steeped in the theological and philosophical traditions of the West, and he offers what I think is a compelling and penetrating assessment of our predicament, our self-understanding in the modern world. And that goes to the fact that he looked at philosophy. So he was looking at, whether it's Enlightenment philosophy, pure rationalism, or theological positions or perspectives. He was convinced that if you really wanted to understand a philosophy, you had to look past its claims on rationality, its claims on science, for example, and look at what it says about the meaning of life and about human beings. For him, you had to look at what a philosophy understood about the fate, about the tragic, about, again, human nature. A more abstract way or philosophical way to put this is to say, for Niebuhr, ontology and epistemology rest on anthropology. And by the way, anthropology, to kind of allude to the earlier talk, is theological. We understand it theologically. And so for Niebuhr, all the philosophical systems that wage war with one another ultimately have their own kind of faith, their own kind of, this is sort of like presuppositionalism a little bit, regarding the meaning of life and the nature of man. So for Niebuhr, if we wanted to understand, surface political problems or religious complications or even philosophical problems, we first had to look at, well, what are the people making those arguments saying about human beings, and are they right or not? He said we had to look at what he called the obvious facts of history, and for him, those facts were what Hegel would have termed history's slaughter bench. It was this kind of tragic understanding of history. Okay, so again, anthropology, then I'm going to move to philosophy, and then we'll talk politics. Niebuhr famously began Human Nature. This is volume 1 of The Nature and Destiny of Man, kind of, I think his masterwork, his Gifford Lectures, with this statement. And I should just say, I'll also use the term man inclusively. I know, again, I'm in academia enough to know that's complicated, but Niebuhr does it, and rather than butcher what he wrote, I'm going to quote him and use that. So if that's the reason for that, so just bear with me. So Niebuhr began Human Nature with this statement: man has always been his most vexing problem. Not politics, not culture, not philosophy, not religion, but human nature. And he contends that the whole history of modern thought, which, by the way, for him, people argue about what is modernity and when does it start. For him, it was basically going all the way back to the Reformation and the Renaissance. So everything after that is this kind of modern world he's talking about. And he thought it was basically humans misapprehending themselves. We're confused. Hence, Time's caption above his picture was "Man's story is not a success story." He attributed a lot of the political chaos he saw, and remember, as crazy as things seem domestically and even internationally now, he's looking at total world war. He attributed a lot of this to a misplaced optimism in human reason and human virtue. So our intellectual capacity and our moral capacity. He basically thought we're naive about these things. And he traces this, and this is a longer conversation. I can talk in the Q&A, or you can read his argument, had to do with his perception that modern world I just described as 500 years draws on strands of classical philosophy and Christianity in ways that they're not completely coherent, so they end up kind of getting confused and intermingled in interesting ways. So in any event, Niebuhr says, against the evidence, against looking at what we see around us, we still think that our rationality is capable not of ameliorating problems, making them a little better, but actually solving them. And so you see this if you think about it. How do we propose solving problems? Well, there's a couple of ways. We think about education, because it's an intellectual problem or a problem of knowledge. Well, we're going to solve it by improving education. Not that that's completely wrong, but that's one trajectory you see. Another trajectory is, well, history bequeaths us all kinds of injustices and problematic social systems. Also true. We solve those by reforming social conditions, by changing, by improving those social conditions. None of which Niebuhr would say shouldn't be done, but his point would be our naivety is that we think we can actually finally solve these problems. I think, again, the lecture, the prior speaker was talking about this idea that government actually can be ultimate, not penultimate, that we can finally achieve these things rather than just make them somewhat better. So another quote from Niebuhr: "The hope that everything recalcitrant in human behavior may be brought under the subjection of the inclusive purposes of mind by the same technology which gained man mastery over nature is not merely an incidental illusion prompted by the phenomenal achievement of the natural sciences, but it is the culminating error in modern man's misunderstanding of himself. The principle of comprehension by which modern culture seeks to understand our present failure belongs to the misunderstanding about man's life and history which contributed to that failure. The spiritual confusions arising from this misunderstanding constitute the cultural crisis of our age, beyond and above the political crisis in which our civilization is involved." So what Niebuhr's saying is, despite all the technological advances we see around us, we misunderstand ourselves, and therefore we misunderstand and misapprehend how we can address the problems we face. Famously for Niebuhr, if you know anything about him, you will know this, part of his argument was we needed to recover an understanding of the Christian idea of sin. That would be kind of the antidote to this naive confidence in human beings' essential goodness. And he ultimately, a little bit more history, he started out as a social gospeler, and he ultimately broke with the social gospel movement, in part because he just said this is naive optimism about human nature, and the reality is we're not what you're saying we are. And Niebuhr would point both to the biblical revelation and also, again, just say, look around you. He famously said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but the one empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian faith is original sin. You read the newspaper. And so, and again, by sin, he's not thinking, it's a problematic term for all kinds of reasons. Again, we can talk about in the Q&A, in that people misunderstand what Christians mean when they talk about sin. What Niebuhr's talking about is this kind of fundamental brokenness, this kind of fundamental bent away from good, pridefulness, failure, self-importance, partiality, and even moral corruption. And so for Niebuhr, he thought, if we can at least recover this conceptually, recover a better understanding of human nature such that we don't have this kind of misplaced optimism that's going to be frustrated and going to result in brutal government because government's going to be frustrated when the optimism doesn't achieve the result. We can still act, but we act more realistically, which is why I think Niebuhr falls into the category of a political realist. Okay, so let me move from the sort of, if you think in anthropology terms, he's thinking, understand this kind of divided human nature in which we need to appreciate the brokenness of man. Okay, that's where you start. Moving out to his political philosophy, which is very much a defense of democracy. But what he does is rethink and I won't say upend, but offer a different account of a defense of democratic politics or democratic political theory than I think we tend to think of. And I think I'm thinking here of, Jefferson's a great example, sort of read some of the French philosophers, this kind of idealistic idea that we're going to free human beings, democracy, the nobility of man. Niebuhr had none of that. His famous line was, and follow this, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. In other words, because we have good, because you can do theologically, we're created in the image of God, the idea of a democratic politics is actually possible. This can work. And because we're corrupt, we need it. It's not a defense of a kind of return to some kind of authoritarianism, and very much the opposite, precisely because with authoritarianism, it's the same thing the founders worried about. You don't want to consolidate power in a fallen person either. So his defense of democracy is very much grounded on this kind of ambiguity of human nature, really a theological account of human nature, rather than kind of some myth of progress or myth of perfectibility, some kind of idealism. And so Niebuhr said, the same radical freedom which makes man creative also makes him potentially destructive and dangerous. The dignity of man and the misery of man therefore have the same root. This insight justifies the institutions of democracy more surely than any sentimentality about man, whether liberal or radical. So in other words, democracy offers us a means to exercise the divine freedom we're given, but also preserve some modicum of political order. Look at my time. Okay. So you're kind of simultaneously grounding your politics or your political theory in the strength and weakness of human beings. Okay, so that was quick, so you've got the human nature, man is divided and broken. Politics, well, we need democracy. This is the way to work out that problem, that question. Well, what does it actually look like in practice? And maybe this is where I think the title Mark gave me was, Niebuhr for today. Again, we're post-Trump, so we can talk about how this fits, but I think it does. And I'm going to talk about humility. Yeah. In The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, yeah, I was waiting for that. Really, you just read the New York Times. Come on. Humility, we used to have that. Okay, so Niebuhr says, democracy, therefore, requires something more than a religious devotion to moral ideals, in other words, kind of idealism. It requires religious humility. And I'm going to echo the last speaker again. Every absolute devotion to relative political ends, and all political ends are relative, is a threat to communal peace. But religious humility is no simple moral or political achievement. It springs only from the depth of a religion which confronts the individual with a more ultimate majesty and purity than all human majesties and values, and persuades him to confess, why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. And so for Niebuhr, what he's saying here, and I think it's very much what the last speaker was saying, is if you understand the penultimacy of your political ends, not that you don't pursue them, but if you recognize that, there's a certain humility and grace that comes with political action that can be lacking if your politics is ultimate. Because if your politics is ultimate, your opponent is your enemy, and indeed is the enemy of all that is good and just. If your politics is penultimate, not necessarily so. And that ties, and I'm going to speed through this because I want to leave time for questions, that ties to Niebuhr's account of tolerance. The failure to recognize, and he's talking here about these idealists again, the failure to recognize the corruption which insinuates itself into the statement of moral law by even the most disinterested idealists leads to the naive and politically dangerous conviction that their own ideals are perfect. In other words, you're going to have a bunch of Pharisees running around trying to tell everybody else how to live all the time. But if we're aware of our own fallenness, we can act politically. Absent this humility, your political opponents become your political enemies, as I said, and the temptation to leverage the full powers of the state upon recalcitrant elements becomes too strong to resist. Okay, speeding through a little bit more. A couple of comments in closing, and then I want to open up to questions. So you get this idea of humility, this idea of tolerance, a sort of grace, maybe another way to put it, in political life. I think the other two pieces of this, forgiveness and hope. Niebuhr writes, man does not know himself truly except as he knows himself confronted by God. In a sense, that's why I say the anthropology is itself theological. You start with this confrontation. I think this is Calvin, beginning of Institutes, same idea, knowledge of man, knowledge of God, right? That's how you find out who you are. In this confrontation with God, we become fully cognizant of our sin. And if we're a sinner, the obvious consequence is not only that we will sin, but even when we're well-intentioned, we may harm the interest and offend the rights of others. Given the technological scope and scale of our society today, given the problems we face, of course, this becomes magnified because our ability to have destructive consequences as a result of our good intentions is much greater. Niebuhr argues in that context, if you know mistakes are going to happen, and they're going to be well-intentioned mistakes, forgiveness is even more critical. Forgiveness is the only proper response, again from Niebuhr, to the contrite recognition that our actions and attitudes are inevitably interpreted in a different light by our friends as well as our foes than we interpret them. It's the final oil of harmony in all human relations. In a broken world, the final truth, the general judgment upon the collective life of man, is that it is invariably involved in the sin of pride. And so he goes on and talks about, what's the nature of history is injuries everywhere. Different groups are injured. This is something we're wrestling with now in our politics. Injuries done and harms caused that can't be remedied just through sort of retributive justice. Here he talks about the idea of forgiveness and faith, hope, and action. The hope of Christian faith that the divine power which bears history can complete what even the highest human striving must leave incomplete, and can purify the corruptions which appear in even the purest aspirations, is an indispensable prerequisite for the diligent fulfillment of our historic tasks. Without it, we are driven to alternate moods of sentimentality and despair, trusting human power too much in one moment and losing all faith in the meaning of life when we discover the limits of human possibilities. So for Niebuhr, when we kind of understand reality, right, we understand who we are and political possibility, and we understand the contingency of our projects, in a sense, we're freed up. We're freed up to act because if we recognize that ultimately God is, Providence, right? God is sovereign. We can act knowing we're doing what we feel called to do, but God's going to take care of what we don't. There's a liberation in that. It's not all on us. There's some of it on us, but not all of it on us. What comes with that, again, is this idea of humility, this idea of being willing to forgive. And I'll just leave you with another famous quote from Niebuhr, and then we can open up for questions. He says, there are no simple congruities in life and history. And I should say, you probably get this a little bit. What people find either appealing or maddening about Niebuhr is he's always kind of doing this, well, things are contingent, things are penultimate, you're not certain. There's always this kind of ambiguity. So there are no simple congruities in life and history. It is possible to soften the incongruities of life endlessly by the scientific conquest of nature's caprices and the social and political triumph over historic injustice. But all such strategies cannot finally overcome the fragmentary character of human existence. The final wisdom of life requires not the annulment of incongruity, but the achievement of serenity within and above it. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime, therefore we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history, therefore we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, therefore we are saved by love. And no virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. I'll stop there and open up for questions. I knew you were going to go first.
I'm going to set you up to pregame my own talk a little bit. So you talk about the ambiguities within Niebuhr, talk about the importance of forgiveness, and that last quote from Niebuhr is one of my favorite because it echoes in so many ways the Serenity Prayer, right? It's all built into that. One of the ambiguities is how does a Christian walk through this world, attempting to be virtuous in a broken world that is cursed by human fallenness? So what is the tension within Niebuhr between what he might call a rule of love, to love your neighbor, but also a moral requirement to be responsible to our neighbor? And sometimes those things seem incompatible because one neighbor is being assaulted by another, and what does love look like in that scenario? How do I act, and what comes of my action for my own sort of moral probity?
Well, hopefully I'm helping set up your discussion. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that in the sense that, and you know this, he kind of has this, he talks about the law of love as being an ideal that we can only approximate, and I think I may just be restating your question, so if I'm setting you up for later, good. What you don't get out of Niebuhr, and I think it's part of Mark's point, is a kind of system, an ethical system. Again, I think it fits well with the last speaker. We don't have a set of rules. And the way he talks about this, he says, look, he calls it the law of love. And by the way, there's another conversation about natural law. He's at least skeptical in the thick sense about that too. But there's this idea the law of love is represented by Christ. It's sort of the person of Christ. And so the law of love informs all of our efforts to seek justice in the world. So it's not necessarily a rule per se, but we can look at what we see around us and perceive injustices. And how do we perceive them? Well, we look at them set against this, basically set against Christ. I mean, I don't think I'm oversimplifying it too much. And so in every political context, the injustice is identified, and hopefully solutions or ameliorations are informed by this law of love. But it's this kind of dialectic thing, or you could also say asymptotic. You never get there, but you can get closer or further away. That's why the critique of Niebuhr as a relativist I don't think is fair. I think he's a relativist to the extent that he would say everything under heaven is relative in that sense. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a law, that God doesn't have a perfection. It just means that we're, in a sense, I mean, that condemns a little strong, but the reality is we're always going to be falling short. And there may be contexts where we act in the circumstance you're talking about. And this is another piece that people find troubling, and it may be setting you up too. Niebuhr's basic view is we live in a world that's shot through with sin, and even in our actions, there's no such thing as an untainted action, in a sense. And friends of mine have written quite eloquently about this. Maybe I'm setting you up too, I don't know. But Niebuhr's view is, look, you're going to have to take action recognizing you might have to ask for forgiveness, right? If you're the judge, if you're the Augustinian judge. That's going to happen. And so what you're not allowed to do is say, well, I'm not sure what to do, so no responsibility. Rather, you're free to exercise that responsibility recognizing that you may not be adequate. I don't know. Yeah. I'm going to see a hand here. Sure.
Thank you, sir. This is a very informative lecture. Thank you for reminding us of the insights of Reinhold Niebuhr. Newt Gingrich said at the inauguration, the United States was embroiled in a civil war. It's a civil war over culture, over symbols, over religious authority. And in the recent months, we've seen really vicious and violent street fights over symbols of the Confederacy. But the long-term fight has been over symbols of religion. And so across the nation, secular humanist groups want to take down any symbol of Christianity they find, whether it be the Peace Cross celebrating World War I victims in Bladensburg, Maryland, or they want to take down the Ten Commandments out of the Supreme Court building in Alabama. So what, can you channel Dr. Niebuhr here for a little bit? What would he say if he were with us today about the widespread attack on Christian symbols in the public forum, in the public space? Is America, since this is a group, focused on Providence, if God is guiding history in America today, do we see Providence heading in the right direction in America or the wrong direction?
So the first part of that question, I'm going to come back to because I don't know if there's a good answer. I think there's actually a pretty quick Niebuhr answer to the end there. And that goes back to this saeculum idea. Niebuhr very much would say, I think, look, all we know is that God enacts justice at the end of history. That's the sort of Christian understanding. And it's totally Augustinian. But the time between Christ's ascension and his second coming is this kind of, things can get better, things can get worse. There are going to be trajectories that are going to move all different kind of ways. Doesn't mean within some block of time there's a decline of some elements or a improvement on some elements, but simply to say that trying to assess where Providence is taking us historically sort of in the world of time, I think Niebuhr would be very skeptical of that on both, on theological grounds, I think. As to the former question, I'm not channeling Niebuhr. I mean, the thing that struck me as so interesting, and I'm going off point a little, is have you guys read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death? People know this? So his whole argument in this book, it's a short book, it's like 100 pages, he wrote it in the 80s, was that we were moving from a world of written word and therefore logical argument to a world of images to communicate ideas. So you're not communicating ideas in a treatise, you're communicating ideas, maybe 140 characters, I don't know, but in pictures. And it strikes me, and I think to your point, it's astonishing to me that our political fights seem to be entirely about symbols. And I'm not diminishing, by the way, symbols have great importance, that's not my point. But when politics presumably is also about sort of real problems, economic problems, social problems, and we're really just fighting about symbols, I don't know what to make of that, other than maybe Postman was right in a way he hadn't even foreseen. I do think the Niebuhrian position with all of this would be much more something we don't see, which is any attempt by either side of these various debates, and some of them I think have more legitimate two sides and some may not. There's no grace. And I think it goes back to this, I think you could make the case that one of the things you lose when you really evacuate Christianity, and this, by the way, is something Nietzsche understood. If you evacuate Christianity completely, you don't just lose this sort of classic Christian, sexual ethics, for example. But you lose the core of Christianity another way, which is this idea of grace and forgiveness and humility. And that, there's God and then there's politics and political life. And now political life is basically a theology, regardless of where you are on this. Well, again, it's the same thing. You're just going to end up, these are pitched battles with no quarter. So I don't know. That's sort of my initial thought. And there's one right here in the front. I don't know who's got the mic.
Hi, Joe. Deborah Erickson, Bucknell University. And, thanks so much for a clear presentation of a Niebuhrian approach to politics. One thing we hear quite a bit these days is wanting to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, a little bit following up on this gentleman's question. Yeah. I just wondered if, since we hear that so frequently, I wondered if you could give us a Niebuhrian analysis of that.
I can give you a very brief Niebuhrian analysis. It's pretentious and ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, so to be clear, Niebuhr very much would say there are identifiable historical injustices in the world that we work to correct. And to be clear, one of those he was talking very much about was race in the U.S. He wrote about it all the way back in the 30s. He wrote about nonviolence. I mean, Martin Luther King very clearly read him and thought about him and took what he was saying. I mean, so in that sense, that's my point where he would say there are particular things we can look at what the law of love is and see where we fall short, and there are trajectories that move in the right way. At the same time, first of all, that phrase tends to be used more of as a bludgeon than as a claim. But I think he would just say, well, what does that even mean? Back to this Augustinian notion, right? The only one on the right side of history, I think, for Niebuhr would be God, to be very flip. But yeah, does that? Yeah. There's one back here.
Stephen Lane, PhD student at Florida State in religious ethics. With what you said earlier about Novak and West and all these others in the pragmatist tradition claiming Niebuhr, this idea of being Niebuhrian, how much is it different from just being a modern Augustinian, given that certain parts, especially of irony, that to me it seems that a Niebuhrian approach is really a historical look back to say that these things either worked or didn't work, they were ironic or tragic, and that being Niebuhrian is really just an Augustinian understanding of sin.
So I'm not sure. I actually have described Niebuhr to people as exactly what you just said. My take on Niebuhr, and it's why I'm glad you asked it that way. Why it's of course interesting, but also a little bit maddening to see him sort of co-opted in so many ways. Again, because I think it's a little bit superficial. Not to suggest those thinkers in that list are superficial in any way, but just, I mean, it's the nature of writing an article in the Atlantic. But what I think Niebuhr's really doing, and I think it's why he's helpful, is he's taking Augustinian Christianity, and I think this is your point, and taking the sort of world of modern thought seriously. In other words, it's not, well, everything after the Reformation is just this massive decline, and we need to, I mean, we could probably talk about all the people making that argument publicly. That's not what he's saying. And he's also not saying, and look at all these great modern philosophers, boy, did we have it wrong. He's saying, look, here's some really insightful things that we need to take seriously. And oh, by the way, here's this confusion and where it comes from. So I don't even think I want to disagree with you. I think you're right. So in that sense, yeah, being a Niebuhrian to me is exactly what you say, which is taking Augustinian Christianity and then also taking modernity seriously rather than just dismissing it whole cloth. Yeah.
Hi, Joe.
Good to see you.
I'm Joe Capizzi from the Catholic University of America. Good to see you again. And as always, we agree on so much. But I want to push you just on a couple of things. You can choose one or respond to both of them.
We've got 5 minutes, so let's see.
The first, of course, as you anticipated, is about the, no act is untainted. There can be a really strong sense of that, and then maybe a much weaker sense of that, right? Maybe the weaker sense would be something that I could actually kind of agree with. Yeah. We're all kind of sinners. Because we are all sinners, anything that we do is going to bear, some expression of that. A stronger sense would be, not merely that are we all sinners, but because of ignorance, because of sin, because of disordered desire, and so on, every act, in a sense, is going to be sinful. It's going to be sinful not merely because it's the expression of a sinner, but it's going to have some sinful component to it. And as an Augustinian of the more Thomistic variety, right? Of course, I only say that here. I mean, at Catholic University, I say I'm not really Thomistic, but here, I kind of come out of my shell a little bit. You're right. I'm going to have a little bit of trouble with that one. So there's that thing, and then the second was on signs. And I basically am sympathetic to your, what you said about signs, and and I guess a concern about us moving towards expressing ourselves only in signs. But Augustine also contributes to this, as you know, to the study of signs, right? And really powerfully recognizes their power, right? Signs have enormous power. Think of, right, the sign of the cross, among other things. So I just want to be careful we don't diminish that. I mean, it may be a turn, and it may be a turn that, in a sense, correlates with a diminishment in the confidence of reason. But it may not be that. It may also be like a return to something more, on the one hand, visceral, right? But on the other hand, expressing reason in a way that challenges and gives us an opportunity. Okay,
Yeah.
so anyway.
I'm going to try to do it. That was great. Those are really good questions. Let me work reverse. I don't think I disagree with you about the second point. My point, I don't hear, and by the way, thank you for that clarification. Don't hear me saying signs and symbols are unimportant. I don't think Niebuhr would say that. I'm not saying that. My only point was to say isn't it interesting that seems to be almost all we're fighting about. But I take your point that, in a sense, they may be proxies for these deeper questions. So hopefully that kind of addressed that other question. I actually think Niebuhr might be the latter that bothers you.
I think so.
I think he is. And that is to say, I think Niebuhr's view is the stronger view of, yeah, everything we do, we just need to accept that there's a dimension of sin that's not because of who we are, but that's going to kind of be acted. Right. And I think that I'm thinking particularly when he talks about, relevant to probably what a lot of what you all talked about yesterday, taking up arms, fighting the Second World War. And of course, historically, you also have to understand this is this is set against the backdrop of somebody who is an ardent pacifist in World War I and turns. And but nonetheless, I think you're right to raise that because I think that's where he is. I mean, for whatever it's worth, personally, I'm probably closer to the weaker view. But and I'm hesitant to call myself a Thomist here, but and as you probably know as well, Niebuhr's very critical of a lot of Thomistic ethics. For another conversation. All of that said, I think where it's helpful is in the sense that I think what he's pushing back against is this kind of perfectionist idea of agency or action, which is I'm looking for the morally untainted action that I can choose. I'm thinking of, much more prosaic example, but when people argue about, well, why do you give money to something? It was totally selfless. Oh, well, but you got a tax break. Or, oh, I felt good. Is there any such thing as real altruism? I think Niebuhr, if you guys have this kind of conversation, I think Niebuhr would be like, who cares? No, probably not. Now go give money. It's that kind of thing. So I don't know if that
Look, it does, and I think the example that always challenges the Thomistic view, aside from altruism, and much more, of interest is sex. The desire for sex, and the way Augustine describes that is right, peculiarly disordered. Notice that Mark got up as soon as I said that.
That's fine. He can take me off right now. Yeah.
That's where I think the Thomist account, particularly as it's expressed today, right, runs into some troubles.
That's, yeah. Thank you.